All right, I'd like to call to order the meeting of the Minnehaha Creek Watershed District Board of Managers for September 8th. All managers are present with the exception of President White. At this point of the meeting, we'll ask anybody if they have any matters from the floor for any kind of a subject not on the agenda or on the consent agenda, that they can come forward at this time. Seeing none, we will go on to approval of the agenda. Can I have a motion to approve the agenda? We have a motion from Manager Miller.
Second.
Second from Manager Maxwell.
Chair Olson,
Comment?
could we pull consent item 7.1 for audit services, please? Had a conversation with Treasurer Loftus, and I think that we can strengthen the analysis and recommendation and bring that back on the 22nd.
Okay, we would normally do that during the consent agenda approval, but I'll change it at
I'm
this
gonna-
time.
Okay, I'm going to
Okay.
recommend that we pull it from the agenda.
It's,
I can recommend.
consider it pulled.
Okay.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Motion carries. Information items and correspondence. Would like to there is none there. Okay, on the consent, do I have approval of the consent agenda with 7.1 being removed? Is there a motion?
So moved.
Manager Jamadi? Is there a second? No, second by Miller. All in favor?
Aye.
Motion carries. Regarding the regular agenda, President White is not here tonight. However, we are going to be doing reviews of the Operations and Programs Committee with Manager Loftus.
Yes. Thank you, Manager Miller. This evening, we had a committee meeting, and we had one item on our agenda, which was our district strategic principles. Our long-term counsel, Lewis Smith, and many of our staff members facilitated a discussion on organizational principles. They've boiled it down to 7, which we reviewed, and they derived those principles off a recent study of our history that Mr. Smith has completed. The next steps are to synthesize the white papers and the resulting principles, which will come to the full board in the near future.
Thank you. Also on some of these updates, we have the MOD Summer Tour, which was attended by Manager White, myself, and Manager Jamadi. I'll ask Manager Jamadi to make some comments about how that tour was, and then I'll add some comments at the end.
We divide this up with how you know some of the details and some of the stuff that happened. When I went there, I had 3 areas of interest that I was interested in. One is to see how it is in a rural versus an urban setting. That was one of the questions in my mind. How did you do it differently? Second was, how did you manage flooding? Because there's such enormous amounts of flood there. How did they manage that? And then the third thing was the impact of climate change. How do they work with that? And in terms of flood management, one of the things that impressed me about it is the enormity of the scale. It's the amount of both financial impact and human suffering is just enormous. It's region-wide from South Dakota up to the border of Manitoba. On each side of the river, both in all states, and so the scale is enormous, and so when they spend money or they do things, it's also huge. There's a town of 2,000 called Warren, which was a dying town because of the flooding, and they figured out a way, and they were very enterprising. They figured out a way to get the water impounded and then bypassed, and that project for population of 2,000 cost $18 million. Bought some of the stuff we do, that just for a town of 2,000. There's a town called Oslo, and Oslo is sort of halfway between Grand Forks and Manitoba, where Manitoba starts. and they have enormous, they get flooded to such an extent that Oslo gets isolated. That is, it's kind of like an island. They can't go in and out of the place. And they also have, you know, the railroad stop, the roads are flooded, and 17% of North Dakota wheat grows along that railroad. So if they block that, they can't do it. All of North Dakota's economy gets affected. Because, you know, North Dakota is an agrarian state. So, you know, there's a group that is from the coalition, formed from the border towns. And they came up with you know, they formed a group and they self-funded and paid someone to do estimates of what it would cost to expand the bridges where the water gets narrowed down and to put up dikes and so on. And the cost for that they estimated was 133 billion, not million, billion. So I was just staggered by the scale of the work that's involved there. It's really startling. And obviously, well, this used to happen every 10 years or so. Now, with climate change, it's happening every couple of years. And that's part of the reason why water was a dying town, because it flooded every year. And people just said, we can't live in it. They want to leave. You know, so the damage to the people and to the economy is enormous. And one of the interesting things that I've seen that they're doing is really out of your report, Lewis. You know, you wrote that report that you asked to be sent to us, you know, that, you know, the source for balanced urban ecology, you know, they're talking about partnerships. How do we work together? We partner between counties, that they partner, you know, across the two states, and now they're talking about partnering across the whole basin, starting from South Dakota all the way up into Manitoba and back. And how do you work together? And you know, getting partnerships of something of that scale is staggering. You know, a lot of these folks have spent a lot of time being out of this area. You know, and they're going to have to work together. How are they going to do it? It's really pretty staggering. The diversity between, you know, up and down there is remarkable, and the diversity in terms of in-state and out-state. You know, between North Dakota and Minnesota, their population is 800,000, less than the population of our metro area here. The entire state has less. So the budget is smaller, you know, it's an agrarian economic engine versus what we have here, which is very different. And there are philosophical differences. And one of the places I saw the philosophical difference was when they were showing the budgets for the projects that are being in North Dakota and the projects that are being done in Minnesota. I noticed that the amount that they assigned to water quality and ecology was much smaller in North Dakota than it was for the projects that are being done on the Minnesota side, which is very interesting. Just so the philosophical differences between them. And yet, you know, they have to work together. So that was sort of the big picture, and the unanswered question that stayed with me at the end of all of this, and I didn't ask it, maybe, and I'm glad I didn't because I didn't want to offend them, was, you know, they live in such a flat land that just a little bit of water goes a long way. And so they have to build dikes and they have to manage the flooding. But the flooding also brings in silt, which helps make the place fertile. So one of the questions I had in my mind was, are they going to figure out a way to cooperate and live with nature, or are they going to try and do what we have been doing, human beings have been doing, which is try to subdue nature? And you know, I don't think subdue nature is going to work when you've got climate change and these kinds of, you know, billions, you know, 133 billion for just that area. You have to learn to cooperate with nature and figure out how to make that work. And so that was a question that just kind of stayed with me at the end of that. So that's a little bit picture.
Thank you. Some of the things that I noticed while we were there too is that the federal government has had a very major effort in dike building. 300 farms have dikes built around all the buildings that are concentrated by the houses with driveways that go right up over the dike. And when the farmer who was on our tour bus was talking about the features of the railway grades being like dams and the dikes that connect to them and all that, he mentioned that when I said to him, "How long have you been here?" "Well, I'm third generation." So 3 generations on that same farm, and his kids are already farming that property for the 4th. And so when we look at that and we go, why do you stick around? I mean, you get flooded out every year. He says, we're not raised thinking about floods. We're raised thinking about boating season. He says, when the snow is melting and the rivers are going to rise, we take the kids to grandma's house and then we get the boat out. And then when the water's at its peak, we pick the kids up and we come back to our house, pull the boat up on the dike, go down the hill into the house, and he says, remarkably, we have power that never really gets interrupted, and we function doing all of the maintenance work on our equipment during that time while the water's there. Then when we need to get groceries, we get in the boat and we go to town and we come home. And he says the kids all have always known it as boating season, which to me was a remarkable way of changing attitude and accepting what they have to endure every year. They also had a very spectacular project in the Lake Agassiz. It's the big ancient, prehistoric lake that used to be in that area, and what they call the Agassiz Valley Impoundment. And they have 2 sections of land, essentially 2 square miles, where they dug down 45 feet. And they let the water from that surrounding area flow into this pit. And the dirt that they dug up is stacked up along the edge of the property. And then they very slowly let that water out and can use it for irrigation and a variety of other things as they need it. So when you're standing when you take 3 buses up to the top of the dike, you can imagine these roads are really wide and strong and big, and they hold all that water in. So this retention idea is practiced all over up there. So 300 farms, many, many cities that have the dike systems around each community. And finally at the end, when we got to Grand Forks, we saw how the water there was held back by a dam and used for irrigation and water supply throughout the year. And they took the dam out. And instead of having this big flow where people had problems if the boats went over and there were drownings and things like that, now what they did is they put in a series of rapids. It has the exact same effect as holding back that elevation of water. It's just that you can now shoot down through the middle with your kayak. And which I thought was a very spectacular way of making it beautiful. It sounded beautiful, it looked beautiful. You're standing next to a rapid river and everything is identical in terms of the cautionary water supply that they wanted to maintain. So when people talk about, if we change the dam in Minneapolis to a series of rapids, I now understand what they're talking about. Up until then I thought, why would you do that? But in a sense, it still holds back the water. It's just a different way of doing it. So I thought it was one of the more spectacular tours. And Manager Jmati's right, it was pretty large scale. So thank you. Next on the agenda, I just wanted to make sure that we understood that the meetings coming up in October are going to be on the 1st and 3rd Thursdays of the month. That's consistent with the October and November scheduling. And finally, we have no public hearings tonight, so we will go to item 10, which is permits requiring a variance or discussion. Item 10.1, permit 22-349, 325 Blake Road, Building A, Hopkins, with Mr. Ernst, and then, not Mr. Ernst, I'm sorry, Mr. Mike Heyman, as well as the discussion, which is actually action item 11.1, which is Resolution 22-055, authorization to execute the agreement for use of regional stormwater management facility and authorization to execute the temporary easement of stormwater management with Alatus in Hopkins.
Good evening, Chair Olson and managers. I'm joining Ms. Ernst up here as part of the permit presentation because items 10.1 and 11.1 are linked. There's a conditional component to the permit that we felt would be beneficial and easiest for comprehending the series of actions if we presented them concurrently before there was actual action on the permit and item 11.1. So I'll join her. Ms. Ernst will present on the permit and then turn it over to me for a presentation on 11.1 before the board considers either the permit or the agreements.
Good evening, Board of Managers. I'll be providing a briefing on permit 22-349 for the construction of Lot 2, Block 2, part of the 325 Blake Road Development Project, and applied for by Alatus. Then going forward, I'm just going to refer to Lot 2, Block 2 as Building A. So this permit is being brought before you because of the district investment in the site and because permit compliance requires that the board approve an agreement and an easement as conditions of approval. So tonight, you'll be asked to consider a decision on the permit application and the conditions of approval. This presentation is going to cover an overall discussion of the site's location and existing and proposed conditions. Then we'll take a closer look at the work occurring or proposed to occur on Building A. We'll look at the existing and proposed drainage. And then lastly, we'll finish up with a rule analysis and a discussion of the conditions for permit approval. So first I'll start with an overall location. So the project is located at 325 Blake Road, which is on the east side of Hopkins and sits right next to Minnehaha Creek. This area is of interest to the district because it contains a historically hidden portion of the creek and is a valuable connection to other district projects. Additionally, this is the future site of a district-owned regional stormwater management facility. Notable landmarks in this area include the Cedar Lake Regional Trail, which is shown here in red. And then next to that, we've got the future Green Line extension here in green. And then we also have Cottageville Park phases 1 and 2 here. And then not on screen, but downstream, we have the Minnehaha Creek Preserve and the Methodist Hospital campus. So the Blake Road parcel here in yellow is about 17 acres, 12 of which were historically impervious surface. And this parcel previously held a cold storage facility and extensive parking areas. The cold storage facility was demolished in 2018, and now the site is mainly aggregate surfacing and vegetation. When the site is fully redeveloped, the impervious surface is proposed to decrease to about 9 acres. And as a reminder, when we view the project through a stormwater management rule lens, to determine what type of treatment they need, we're looking at the historical impervious on site rather than the vegetation and aggregate surfacing that exists there currently. So this is why the project is considered to be redevelopment. So now that I've covered the site as a whole, I'm going to focus more on the actual permit's location. So the image on the right shows a close-up of the proposed project area, and it sits at the northwest corner of the parcel. So the applicant is proposing to construct a multi-unit residential building with associated courtyards, parking, sidewalks, and stormwater infrastructure. So the parcel is about 1.3 acres in size and has 1.09 acres of impervious surface. And the project is proposing a 6% decrease of impervious surface to 1.026 acres. So now I want to focus a little bit on the current and proposed drainage and storm sewer networks in the area. So in 2013, the district completed a feasibility study which showed that runoff from about 270 acres of land surrounding 325 Blake Road, so that's that area shown here in blue. This can be captured and diverted to a future treatment facility on 325 Blake Road. So based off of that study, we constructed 2 diversions here in red at Lake Street and Powell Road, and currently both of those diversions are bulkheaded until the treatment facilities are online. So in the future, those diversions are going to be extended and are going to take water from that huge catchment area and route it into the regional system here in blue. So about 30 acres is going to come from the Lake Street diversion and about 217 from the Powell Road diversion, and the remainder of that from the Blake Road parcel itself.
What's the total number?
264. I rounded a little bit. So again, the permit before you is just for Building A, but I wanted to show the broader plan because part of Building A is going to be using our regional system for stormwater treatment. So Building A is shown right here in yellow, and the items in red that are connected to it, that's the stormwater infrastructure that's directly associated with the permit and the project we're reviewing right now. And then these two green arrows, that's showing how stormwater drainage is split across the parcel. So the southern portion of it is going to route to these underground infiltration basins for treatment. Then in extreme rain events, high flows are going to pass through those, go into the Lake Street diversion, and go into the regional treatment facility. Then the northern portion is going to connect directly into the diversion extension and then flow to the regional facility after receiving pre-treatment. All right, so now that we've covered all the background and the proposed plans, I want to get into the rule analysis. So based off of my review and engineer's review, the project complies with all applicable district standards. The first rule that was triggered was erosion control due to the proposed disturbance of over 5,000 square feet. And the applicant has provided an erosion and sediment control plan, which ensures that the disturbed soils are going to remain on site and not negatively impact any downstream water resources. And the plan is in compliance with our rules. Then the second rule triggered is the stormwater management rule due to the proposed change of impervious on site. So as I mentioned previously, the impervious is proposed to decrease by about 6%. Therefore, it's going to be viewed as redevelopment with a decrease in impervious surface, and it'll be required to provide 1 inch of abstraction over the proposed impervious surface. So the applicant is proposed to meet that requirement through 2 methods. As I mentioned before, this northern portion here is going to be treated with a regional facility, and then the southern portion is going to be treated with underground infiltration basins. And for both of these treatment facilities, it's providing volume treatment in excess of what is required. Here you can see a breakdown of how much impervious surface is being routed to the regional facility versus the underground facility. And you'll note here that I have amount to be decided. So the regional facility's volume abstraction is expected to be well beyond the required amount, and that is going to be finalized later this fall. It'll come before the board again. And then this abstraction number is also much larger, and it's accounting for future building phases. So due to project phasing and land acquisition, both of these facilities are not expected to be functioning by the time Building A is complete. And the stormwater rule does require that treatment facilities be functioning by the time a project's complete. To remedy that, the applicant is proposing an infiltration basin to be used for interim treatment. So the proposed infiltration basin, which is shown here in blue, is going to provide slightly more than the required amount of volume treatment for Building A's proposed impervious. And it's important to note that this infiltration basin already exists on site. The only thing that they're doing is adding conveyances to route stormwater to it. So here in red, that represents a temporary pipe that's going to route the northern portion. And then this arrow in green represents a grass swale that will route the southern portion. So again, this is going to be used until those facilities are online. And again, with both the permanent infrastructure that will go in and this interim infrastructure, the volume control standard has been met, and it's in compliance with our rules. Then I also wanted to bring up this. So there are some additional parameters that we've reviewed. So by virtue of meeting the volume control standard, rate and water quality benefits are also provided. So due to the increase, or the proposed decrease, excuse me, in impervious surface and the addition of the stormwater management facilities, rates are expected to decrease for all storm events. And as for water quality benefits, by meeting the volume control standard, you're also providing phosphorus control. And that interim infiltration basin is actually going to be providing 100% removal of TP and TSS. Okay, so lastly, I want to move on to the conditions for permit issuance and provide a little bit more detail about item 1. So due to the logistics of project phasing, land acquisition, and the necessity for stormwater treatment, the applicant's ability to meet the rule requirements rests on its use of the district's regional facility and its temporary use of other land within the 325 Blake Road site that is still under the district's ownership. So an agreement and easement are proposed so that the applicant can meet these rule requirements. So first is the agreement for the use of the regional stormwater facility. The stormwater rule requires that if an applicant is proposing to treat stormwater with a regional facility, they have to have the legal right to do so. So the proposed agreement is going to allow them to use the regional facility to treat that northern portion of Building A, in addition to constructing and maintaining conveyances to the facility. Then second is the temporary easement for stormwater management. So this easement is going to allow the interim infiltration basin to be used while it sits on the district-owned property, because stormwater is required for the permit. So we have to have that easement in place before permit issuance. So both of these items are going to be decided on separately after Mike's presentation. The Board of Managers, to sum up what you've heard tonight, Alatus is proposing to construct Building A and associated stormwater management facilities as part of the overall 325 Blake Road project. And it triggers both the erosion control rule and the stormwater management rule and is in compliance with both of those. And to allow the applicant to comply with them and our standards, an agreement and easement are proposed for the use of the regional facility and for temporary use of the district-owned land for stormwater management. And staff are recommending permit approval with those conditions listed on the screen. Thank you. I'll now take any questions about, well, I'm going to pass over to Mike and we can do all the questions at the end, or if there's permit specific ones, happy to answer.
Before we try to make any motions here, can you go back to that slide with the red and green arrows? There we go. Our new water treatment facility is to the right of that arc, correct?
Yes.
So that arc is the wall?
Yes.
Okay. And therefore, will that wall be built while we're using this temporary storage area? And will we be finished with our area before the temporary storage area is repurposed?
I think there is some question about the phasing, but we have been working closely with Alatus to make sure that that interim facility isn't getting in the way of stuff that we need to build for our project.
Thank you.
All right, I'll pass it over to Mike.
What's the red pipe?
It's just a temporary plastic pipe.
It's plastic, and it works fine during the winter, it won't freeze up, won't crack.
I'm gonna pass that one over to District Engineer Chris Meehan. I'm not sure.
Manager Maxwell, yes, it's very deep enough that we won't have to worry about
Also, is it,
Underground.
that's underground, that dig that on, and the other one's overgrown.
Yes.
The green one was on top of it.
Swale, yeah. Okay. Imagine it left us.
You mentioned the infiltration basin in that image is already there. How did it get there? What does it look like?
Yeah, Manager Loftus Managers, that was constructed as part of the demolition process, so there was
Okay.
always anticipation. At the time of demolition, we were working with the developer, and we're anticipating a sequence of development over a period of years, which is why we
Okay.
memorialized both the redevelopment impervious acreage at the time and constructed temporary sediment basin for the fact, due to the fact that it was going to be sitting in a dormant phase for a long period of time. There's also erosion control measures still remaining on the site, protecting Minnehaha Creek.
Okay. And then, I know you're probably getting to this, but the project is utilizing 2 district facilities, the regional and then the infiltration basin that exists. That's contemplated and compensated for in our pro formas of further down the project?
Yeah.
Different phases?
Yeah, Manager, Office
Okay.
Manager, I can cover that in a little bit more detail here.
Okay, perfect.
Certainly get into how the agreement is structured to handle some of
Okay,
that.
thank you.
How many units is that apartment?
116 units, I believe.
116?
Yes. 100% affordable. So, good evening, managers. As noted earlier, we are before you with Resolution 22-055, which is the authorization to execute said agreement and temporary easement with Aladdis Hopkins Lagtech 1 LLC. Ms. Ernst noted that the permit for Lot 2, Block 2 is conditioned on approval of the agreement and easement, and there are, in fact, 2 separate documents before you within your packet in draft form for your review. Before I get into the details on the agreement and easement, I just wanted to provide a quick background on the overall master development plan, because some of this is actually occurring due to sequencing being flipped, with Building A now coming before the master development itself, or the remainder of the master development. And I think that will also help ground the board in what was memorialized as part of the acquisition process, because there are existing agreements and easements already on the site due to the sale of that property. And so with, let me grab the laser pointer. With the master development itself, this is the site master plan that we often reference in many of the agreements. Building A, of course, is this portion on the northernmost part of the site. The master development plan contemplated stormwater and stormwater management comprehensively, not just from the regional treatment facility and the offset due to the stormwater cascade, but the developer is required to treat their stormwater for all of the new development, and is doing so. But through the process of collaborating during the design charrette and additional design meetings on the master development plan, the constraints for stormwater on this site all occur on the northernmost portion of the site, in terms of ability to get that water into an effective stormwater BMP versus utilizing more creative measures throughout the remainder of the site. So there's underground infiltration basins that are located between all of these buildings here that Ms. Ernst noted in red in her presentation. There's also a series.
Are they under the buildings?
They will be underground in all of this plaza area, Manager Miller.
And
For
those
the-
are for sale units?
They'll be below, some of them will be, so they'll be between these are essentially 3 lots. You have Building 1, which we also often call Building A, Building B, and then this is the townhome for sale.
And those are for sale units, the townhouses?
Correct, and all of the
They're gonna
under,
have- They're going to have water treatment facilities under them?
they'll be under the utility easement, which is this corridor that the
Okay.
laser pointer is
All right,
moving on.
thank you.
Yep, absolutely. And so, yeah, there's a whole stormwater plan that we have through the PFA grant application. I opted to not bring that up this evening because it's quite complex, but there is a series of underground infiltration basins also beneath the pervious pavement near Building C, and then of course we have the stormwater cascade, which implements a variety of infiltration practices as well. So through the conversations with the developer, as we designed the regional facility and they were working on the site master plan, there was a greater benefit to the regional project to allow for drainage of this northern portion to the regional system, which could handle that water. And in return, they were treating stormwater and recirculating stormwater to a benefit that was approximately tenfold of what they would do if they would treat in the northern portion of the site. And I think that's important because part of the agreement you will see is structured on that master development plan. And so just to remind the board, when we sold Lot 2, Block 2, which is the 1.34 acres of property identified here, we were working specifically to shift the timing of the development, as I noted, which was going to create some constraints, but ultimately result in what we hope to be a better project area. It resulted in us recharacterizing the site through the purchase agreement in an amendment to the purchase agreement, so that 1.34 acres was sold as Phase 1A. And then Phase 1B, the remaining 7.5 acres, which would include the right-of-way, was anticipated to be sold in early spring of 2024. At the time of closing, there were a variety of agreements and temporary easements that were initiated. So the Lot 2, Block 2 area was the 1.34 acres that we referenced. We do have an access agreement for ingress-egress into that site. That's the area outlined in green. That presently exists and was recorded as part of the closing. In addition, there's a construction easement to accommodate staging. They need to flip the materials out there, so the giant pile of aggregate needs to move from that northern portion, which is actually in the way of the district's regional project as well, move that to the south portion. They'll be moving it to this area here, which is part of the Phase 2 acquisition. And then there also are some encroachment easements that are temporary, so they can so that Alatus can construct the adjacent sidewalks to the Lot 2, Block 2 parcel. So the agreement for use of the regional stormwater facility, to get into some of the details of that particular agreement, it provides for use of the regional stormwater facility under a variety of scenarios. And it's listed in a variety of scenarios because there is the baseline consideration that we always anticipated a portion of the site draining to the regional facility, but for an interim period of time, there may be other areas draining, and if the master development plan were to actually fall through, there's a scenario in which then Alatus would need to compensate the district for use of the regional facility beyond what was anticipated. We delineate the portions of impervious specifically draining to the facility. To the note about cost for use of regional stormwater facility, we've actually calculated based on proportional costs, long-term operations and maintenance, and I'll get into those details shortly. There's the assignment of responsibility for designing and constructing the conveyance, which of course rests with Alatus. And then of course, there's a requirement for Alatus to compensate the district for engineering and legal costs associated with this request and future requests if they were to actually tie to the facility. The final 2 points are important, but they're relatively straightforward in the agreement, so I wanted to just briefly touch on the top 3 because that's where some of the agreement becomes a little bit dynamic, dependent upon how the site and future development plan shakes out. So the master development plan itself is relatively straightforward in how the drains will work on this site. The northern portion of impervious 0.425 acres, as Ms. Ernst noted, will drain to the regional facility through a series of pipes that will connect to our trunk line. The southern portion, which is about 0.515 acres, will drain south to what will be an underground infiltration basin. There are adjacent sidewalks that will also be treated in that underground infiltration basin. And that is how this would look under the master development scenario. If the master development plan does not proceed, which is contemplated in the agreement because there is still that risk that that could take place until the remaining portion of the property is sold, the full site will drain to the regional facility. The north conveyance would remain the same, so there will be the pipe work already installed and it will connect to our trunk line. A new south conveyance would need to be built by Alatus, and that is demonstrated here with the red line that you see. And we've worked with our engineers. Laux has submitted what the pipe work would look like, what the grades would be, what restoration and additional maintenance would be required for that, and it would attach to our trunk line as well. But at the time of design and construction, if that scenario were to crop up, we would be working closely with Alatus, and it would need to be approved by the district. In that scenario, Alatus would pay the proportional cost for use of the facility, which is calculated to $121,000. That includes the proportional cost for a slight redesign for the facility because we'd be accepting a bit more water than presently anticipated, but the master development plan wouldn't be moving forward in this scenario and we would have the space to do it. The proportional cost of construction, we're talking about approximately 1 acre of the facility that's treating nearly 270 acres, and then 50 years of operations maintenance, which was calculated at about $1,600 a year for 50 years, based on what it typically costs to maintain an infiltration basin. This will be protected through the agreement with a letter of credit that is to be provided by Alatus within 30 days of signing the agreement. The letter of credit will be for $150,000 to accommodate both the scenario in which they drain to the regional facility because of the master development plan not working, as well as additional costs for the district for engineering and legal services. And I do want to just note for board managers that weren't here during the Minnehaha Preserve Enhancement Project, which was the partnership with Japs Olson. This isn't a unique situation. We actually worked through this exact same scenario with Japs Olson at that time. And we've been applying a very similar algorithm and understanding of the project. At that time, we had where Japs Olson would have paid the Watershed District $188,000 for draining to the 325 Blake Road site if they didn't proceed with their project and transfer the land for the enhancement project in those basins. They, of course, did do that project, and the district did not need to secure those funds. But I thought that would be good to note for those that weren't around for that. This is the second time we've structured a similar agreement for 325 Blake Road. Regarding the temporary easement for stormwater management, this is a little bit more straightforward. It just delineates the use of the burden parcels for temporary stormwater management, and then designates that Lattice is responsible for both preventing anything other than stormwater from discharging to that basin, and that they have to restore the burdened parcels upon completion. Again, it is anticipated that we will sell the property that the temp said basin is on is part of the Phase 1B acquisition. So the next phase acquisition, the temp said basin would actually transfer over to Lattice. But in an instant where it doesn't, the easement does allow for them to complete construction of Building A, so they can complete that before they would need to restore the site. The important thing I think to note here is there are no new lands encumbered by this agreement. There already are the construction easements and access agreements. Really what we're doing is designating a responsibility for Lattice to maintain this temporary stormwater facility if need be, so providing a little bit of additional property for access to do that on a necessary basis. So we're delineating specifically what's used for temporary stormwater management only. It includes the area in blue, and we have a new exhibit that Lauk's provided today that is a bit more clear on this. And then it's this swale that runs through the site, and then the underground pipe. That is all that's allowed under this temporary stormwater easement. All other construction activities are covered in the present construction easement. And so assuming approval and conditions are met, Lattice would hope to mobilize sometime next week to start with some of their footings and foundations. They are planning for a groundbreaking ceremony in October, and I think there's some more information on that during the administrator's report tonight. They'll be working throughout the fall to secure finalized financing for Phase 1B, and still anticipate closing early in 2023 on the Phase 1B property. And then the actual timing for completion of Building A, which is the building before you this evening, is approximately January 2024, assuming no delays in their construction schedule. So with that, we are recommending Resolution 22055, authorization for the district administrator to execute those agreements and easements with non-substantive changes on advice of council. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
You want a motion?
Well, I'd like to talk to council just for a second. Are we looking for a vote on Ms. Ernst's permit, or does that require our approval?
Yes.
Okay, do we do that second?
I would recommend that you do it in the order on the agenda.
In
The
order on the
permit first
agenda.
and then the conditions.
Okay.
I got a question. On that staging area, say they how long do they have that under their control? Say they abandon the subsequent phases. When do we get it back?
Manager Miller, managers, it would be expiring January 31st, 2024.
Okay, great.
Okay, do I have a motion?
Well, I have a question.
Oh.
The line of credit, is that an open-ended line of credit, or is it, you gotta redo it every year?
They'll be, Manager Maxwell managers, they'll be providing a letter of credit for $150,000 that is to stay for the duration of the project and the facilities, and then, of course, is very specific in terms of how we can draw on it under two very specific
So we
scenarios.
don't have to worry about renewing it every year, and they don't, so it's an open-ended one.
Right.
Which you don't see very often on lines of
Well,
credit.
it's a letter, not a line. It's a letter of credit that we can.
Oh, just a letter, okay, all right,
Yeah.
okay, I was thinking line of credit,
Yeah.
okay.
Are we ready? Okay. With that, do I have a motion for approval of permit 22-349, Building A in Hopkins, with the conditions as listed in
Move approval.
So moved.
Okay, we have a motion from Manager Miller, second by Manager Hajmati.
I just want to know why this isn't more complicated. This is really beyond.
All those in favor, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Congratulations. Now, as far as the resolution, 22055, do I hear a motion for approval?
So moved.
Manager Loftus,
Second.
second by Manager Maxwell. Discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Heyman, for all your due diligence. Looks like you covered a lot.
Yeah. Sounds like it was a long struggle the last couple of weeks.
We got there.
Yeah.
Thank you. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Next on the agenda is item 11.2, resolution of 22056, authorization to contract for pilot model scenario file development. Ms. Cermak.
Good evening, Board of Managers. I'm here tonight seeking authorization to contract for pilot model scenario file development. Since I'm here with a scope of work that supports our pilot model, I thought I would take advantage of the time and refresh us on what we're trying to accomplish with the pilot model and highlight some of the work that we've accomplished to date. I'm going to start off by positioning where the pilot model and our modeling work sits within our climate action framework. Touch on what the pilot model objectives are, and then the work we've accomplished to date, and some of the next steps we'll be tackling with Kimley Horn. And that'll bring me to the scope of work that's in front of you tonight, which is for scenario file development, and wrap up with a recommendation. So as we know, climate change is stressing both our natural and our built systems, which has led to a lot of pressing questions that we haven't had the proper tools to fully answer. And that's why Pillar 1 of our climate action framework is centered around developing those tools. And one of those key tools we've identified is a new watershed-wide 2D model. So with this new watershed-wide model, we're looking to take advantage of the access we now have to high-resolution spatial data sets like LIDAR and stormwater infrastructure, which we didn't have back in the early 2000s when we built our current XP-SWIM model. This is going to allow us to characterize how water is moving through our watershed, so how water is moving through our pipes, our wetlands, our ponds, and our BMPs, which will give us the ability to quantify the impact of climate change and begin evaluating and prioritizing climate adaptation strategies along with potential projects. However, each of these data sets does come from a different source, and all is stored in a different format. So that poses some unique challenges, and they do all require an immense amount of work upfront to process them and get them model ready. So because of that, we've identified the need to develop a repeatable automated workflow to process all those data sets and make them model ready. And we also identified that we need to select the right model for the job. We want to ensure we're selecting a model that really serves the district's current needs in climate planning. And so in order to ensure success, the district just decided to pursue the pilot model build. At the end of 2021, in December, the board awarded the contract to Kimley Horn to carry out the pilot model scope of work at $240,000. There was 5 key kind of task areas within that scope. I'm going to briefly walk you through the work that we've accomplished to date in areas task 1 and 2, and then I'll outline some of the upcoming work we'll be tackling and how the scope of work tonight kind of fits in and supports the project. So right off the bat, we developed an evaluation approach with Kimley Horn, along with a corresponding evaluation matrix, which will help us evaluate the technical and operational abilities of each model as we work through the subsequent steps of the project. And this will be a key tool that we use when we go to kind of select which model we scale watershed-wide. Next, we dove into developing the automated geospatial data workflows. And what I mean by that is really figuring out how we take each data from its raw source and getting it processed into the format that each of the 2 modeling tools that we're testing out through the pilot will require. And so we've done that. We've shaped what this process is going to look like, and we've fully built out all the scripts that are hidden behind each of these boxes and arrows. And so this diagram here shows kind of at the highest level how each data set will flow through into a standard format, become model ready, and then get formatted into each of the modeling platforms that we're testing for the pilot. One kind of exciting finding and a result of the approach we've landed on that I'd like to highlight tonight is that a bulk of the processes and scripts that we've developed through the pilot is largely independent of which modeling platform we end up picking. And this is really going to be beneficial and serve us well in the future because what we've done is we've developed a process to standardize all these data sets and get them cleaned and complete in a model-ready format that we can not only take advantage of for the upcoming watershed-wide build, but any future modeling applications or GIS analysis. So now that we've developed our approach for evaluating the 2 models and developed our system to create the model-ready data sets, we can transition into actually using that data and building out the 2 models in our 2 discrete pilot geographies. Shortly to follow the model build will also be scenario analysis work. And running land use scenarios through a model does require upfront building out of GIS data sets that depict the land use scenario that you're trying to run. And so we had developed a shared understanding with Kimley that the district would work in parallel to first refine what exactly we wanted those scenarios to look like, and then to develop those files outside the pilot model's scope of work. So R&M's been tracking the scope of work that's in front of you tonight. We've included budget for it in 2022, and we had planned to work with Stantec for this since so much of the work is centered around our permitting rules. So first we had to really refine what exactly we wanted the conditions to depict, and we had 2 kind of guiding goals during those discussions. First, we really wanted to represent real questions that we had and real future proposed development situations to give us a realistic look at the level of effort it takes to not only develop the files, but the challenges associated with weaving those into each of the modeling platforms. We also wanted to make sure that we were maximizing the utility of the scenario results and having them serve more than just the pilot model's needs. So we worked collaboratively with our partner at the City of Edina, along with internal discussions with policy planning and project planning staff, and kind of really refined what exactly we wanted those scenarios to depict. In essence, we're really evaluating how development paired with our regulation will impact volume. So then we were able to sit down with Stantec and kind of outline the key components it would take to get these files developed. So some of the key areas of work you'll see in the scope tonight involve evaluating all of these land use scenarios under the district's permitting rules. With that understanding, they will size, place, and develop volumes for each of those new established BMPs. And then they, of course, need to link all those new systems into the current system's hydrology. 2 discrete deliverables from this scope. They will be developing the GIS files required for us to give Kimley for them to run the scenarios for the pilot. But we also, in the spirit of the pilot project, really want to take advantage and learn from this experience. So we've asked them to develop a technical memorandum to really memorialize our approach to developing these files, any key findings we've discovered, and some recommendations for how we can develop similar scenarios in the future when we scale watershed-wide. This scope of work comes in at just under $27,000. I did want to acknowledge this is kind of over the district's policy of going out for competitive quote at $25,000. In this case, we did not go out for a competitive quote. Staff is recommending that Stantec is uniquely qualified since a bulk of the work is centered around the interpretation and administration of the district's permitting rules. If we were to go with a different consultant for this scope of work, we would have asked Stantec to review their interpretation and review the files, which would have resulted in some duplicate effort and duplicate costs. So because of those two reasons, staff is recommending approval of Resolution 22056 to contract with Stantec for the development of the pilot model scenario files. I did want to note we are making one small non-substantive change to the scope of work that's in the packet tonight. As I mentioned, we're asking Stantec to interpret the land use changes based off the district's permitting rules. In the scope within the packet, we had called out that we would use the proposed draft stormwater rule based off the revision process. But after further discussions, we've decided to change that language to having them use the current stormwater management rule to best serve the pilot model's needs. So with that, I can take any questions.
First of all, do I have a motion to approve?
Move approval.
A motion from Manager Miller,
So moved.
second by Jamadi. Discussion.